How you doing, guys? Today we're going to start the reassembly of a 5003 or 5010 wheel horse Suburban transmission. Specifically, the 5003 was found on the RJ 58, 59. The 5010 was found on the 60 and 61 Suburbans. It's a three-piece case. The only material difference, I guess, is on a 5010, which this is, the brake band holder is up here at an angle at the top of the transmission. On a 5003 RJ, this block is actually right here, right in like this position, straight up and down, for the different brake band and clutch setup that's found on an RJ compared to a Suburban. Now, I had just heated this up with a torch just a little bit, not to bring it to cherry hot, but just to warm it up. So that way I could just use my vise in order to straighten it out. Because this thing had a pretty severe warp coming up. So I heated it up, bent it in the vise, then I clipped it a couple times with my baby sledge. And what we can see here is this guy is flat enough now where we can start putting it together. Yeah, that looks good. All right, let me get set up and we'll get on with this project. The first thing I'm going to tackle for the reassembly of the transmission is I'm going to put the differential together. Just to go over the parts that are going to be needed, we're going to need the differential and the bowl gear, which is all casted as one piece. We're going to need two axles. These just happen to be new axles. This end with just the woodruff key slot is for the hubs. That end with the hole and the woodruff key is the end of the axle shaft that goes into the differential itself. That woodruff key engages into the axle gears. The axle gears are held in by the roll pins, and the woodruff key is a 1/4 inch by 1 woodruff key. We're going to need 4 pinion gear shafts and the associated roll pins that hold it into hold the pins in the differential. And we're going to need 4 pinion gears. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of sand the sides of these brand new woodruff keys down so they fit into the axle shafts a little easier. These are pretty tight, which is good. That's how you want it. But when you're trying to reassemble this and you're trying to slide the axle shaft down, trying to engage this gear, so this thing totally slides on, and then get the roll pin in there, it's just easier to kind of sand these down so they go into the slots real easy, real nice, little, just firm, but go in. Also, that'll correspond with the gear. We'll test fit the gear a couple times onto the shaft. I usually try to keep, this woodruff key with this shaft with that gear, like just kind of put that set together so that way I know when I start to assemble it, it should all kind of slide together. So let me get this filed down or sanded down, get one of the gears to fit nice on the end of the shaft, and I'll be right back. So with just a couple strokes of the brand new woodruff key on my sandpaper, back and forth, flip it over, back and forth, I was able to create just enough clearance that this woodruff key fits in just right. Now, let's see, we can just get that there. There we go. There's no slop. There's no nothing. It has a little bit of force to push it into the slot, but it's in the slot and it should be all set. I take my axle gear. It slides on nice and smooth. Everything looks real good. Very little play, which is exactly what we want. And now when I go to put this together, it should slide together really nice. I'll do the same thing for the next axle. Get that all fitted in, and then we'll actually start putting the differential together. Okay, in this camera angle, I'm hoping I can show you how the differential kind of goes together. It's a little different than like a 3-speed transmission or an 8-speed transmission in the sense that we have the entire differential and bowl gear all casted as one. We have one axle gear for each side, as I had shown you before. There, it's pretty simple. They go in, the machine side fits into the differential itself. So we're just going to slide that around and get that into place. Then you're going to take your next one, and again, you're going to just kind of get it in place and slide it in. You're going to just kind of locate where your keyway is in the gear. Line that up with the Woodruff key. In this case, I got it kind of pointing straight down, so I'm hoping that this will kind of just slide in. And there it is. So there's the keyway. Now, just make it go flush with the gear for right now. Then you're going to take the next one, the keyway's below, and we're going to slide that in until it slides in also. Now, with both the, you use your fingers just to hold it, but you're going to slide that shaft in enough that you're just going to, and I was hoping you could see it, but the roll pin hole is right there. And then we're going to take the next one, and then we're going to rotate that one until we just see the roll pin hole. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these, I believe these are 1/4 inch roll pins. I'm going to clean them up, and then I'm just going to pound them into the holes. That holds the whole axle assembly in place. You got to do that first before you put the pinion gears in. Still with the cooking show view of the differential, we're going to install the pinion gears. Now, they ride on a pinion gear shaft. There's a shoulder on one end. There is a roll pin access hole on the other end. They run from the bull gear side, well, I should say the end with the shoulder rides from the bull gear side to the opposing side. And the reason for that is in order to get the roll pin through, you're going to need to hammer it in on this side. It's actually kind of recessed in, and I'll show you that right now. You take the pin slides all the way across. Obviously there would be a pinion gear riding on that, and then eventually you'll line up the holes of this pinion gear shaft and this pinion gear shaft. Okay, right now they're facing you, but they should be facing each other. And then what you would do is you take one of the roll pins and then run it down in this fashion, so that way it holds the pins in place as well as keeps them from walking out when the differential's spinning. The other thing is you have the 4 pinion gears. These gears are going to run in an opposing setup just like any other differential. So I'm just going to go ahead and set these in. I may even put the roll pins in. I mean, you just as when you're sending the roll pin down, you just line them up so that way they meet up, and you just split the difference. Kind of like what I did here with the roll pins on the axles. I'm hoping you can see that. Let me just slide that over. I roll it down. You can see I just centered the roll pins in the axle ends, and that holds everything together. There we go. The differential of an RJ or a Suburban is back together. We have our pinion gears. The 4 pinion gears are in opposing pattern. The pinion gear shafts are pinned in with the roll pins. The shoulder side is in place. As I showed you, the axle gears are installed. The roll pins for holding the axle gears in place are there. They're evenly pushed in. The axles themselves are in. And one thing about these differentials that are kind of interesting, the axles themselves are kind of loose in the differential, because there's really nothing other than the axle gear itself holding it steady in the housing itself. And it's not until the axle bushings that I showed you in the prior video that actually holds the end of the axle in place. So really, all the weight and force of the tractor, at least on the back end, is on the top side of the bushing here at the axle end, the gear, and then basically the top side of the differential. And that's the reason why when we looked originally at the side covers, there was a lot of wear at the top section of the tubes, and that's because the weight of everything is pushing down. So you got a lot of weight here, a lot of weight here, and then on the axle gear it's opposing. It's actually on the bottom because this axle's literally being twisted like this when somebody sits on the tractor. All right, next up we're going to start putting the gear shafts and everything into the side covers. With the differential together, the next step to putting the transmission back together is installing the reverse gear. Now the reverse gear has a ground side. You can kind of see that the teeth are a little bit rounded off. This is a straight cut side. We need to make sure that the ground side faces the left side of the transmission, and that's determined from seated on the tractor. So in other words, the right side is the input shaft side, the left side is where the brake band is. So we're going to need to install this gear in this position. It basically goes between these two cast iron posts. There is a reverse gear pin. It's very similar to the pinion gear pin. The only thing is it's a little bit shorter. It just goes ahead and slides in that position. So basically what I'm going to do now is pretty simple. Set the gear in there with the ground side towards the left, put in the pin, and then drive the roll pin in. I do it in this position, so basically the pin goes like that because you have these two stops that will keep the pin from rotating around if it does move. So just do the roll pin in a straight sense. All right, let me get that done and we'll move on. With the reverse gear installed, and as you can see, I have the roll pin in place, the gear's in place, everything spins real nice and free. I'm happy with that. Before I actually put the transmission together, especially with these three-piece transmissions, I like to kind of fit everything together first, dry, before I go ahead and, put the gaskets and all that stuff in place. That means making sure that the two woodruff keys in the cluster gear shaft, they go in nice and smooth. These gears with the keyway, they go in nice and smooth. Everything slides nice and smooth. Same thing with this gear that's on a woodruff key. Make sure that I gotta lift it up, but make sure the cluster gear spins on the shaft, no binding, everything seems to be smooth. The slide gear, get the outboard slide gear in place. Make sure there's no issues with the snap ring that holds it in place. So that all looks real good. Next thing, because of the virus situation, I'm really not going out of the house. So I rethreaded all the original bolts. They're all mint. Made sure all those are in good shape. Same with the shift arm detent bolt. Made sure that's in good shape. The next thing is I set the right side of the transmission in the vise. Make sure the input shaft goes in. It spins real nice and smooth. Check all the bearings. Make sure they are all spinning fine in both sides of the case. And then I'll just actually put the transmission together. I'll put the differential, the brake shaft, put everything back together. Put the other side cover on. Obviously not bolt it down because I'm not going to use the center section. But I'll put it together, make sure everything fairly lines up, make sure the left side of the case is going to slide over the axle shaft as well as the brake shaft, so that way we can set it right down. I've already done that. This transmission goes together fairly well. The brake shaft is a little tight for some reason, so I do have to kind of, I had to give it a couple of wraps with my hand in order to get it to set down. But I'm going to set up right now to actually put the transmission together. I just wanted to let you know that I tried dry fitting it together first to make sure I can avoid as many issues as possible. To start the reassembly process, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the right side, the input side of the transmission, put it in a vise or in a very secure location, so that way it doesn't move, it stays put. Put the input shaft in, just slide it in through the two R12 bearings. Just make sure it spins free. I did put a little bit of WD-40 on the bearings just to help them roll a little bit. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the gasket that we have here for the side cover to center section, and I'm going to outline or just draw in an outline of the inside. And the reason for that is just before, and you'll see it a little bit later in the video, we set the case in place. I am going to put a little Permatex on the gasket, because on this side at least, because there is some pitting right here in the gasket area, just to kind of seal it up, especially on the bottom. And it just makes life a little easier to run my finger around with the sealer, drop the gasket in place, and then bring the case half or the case center section over and start to bolt it together. So that's what I'm going to do right now, and then we'll get to putting the gears in. Now back to the cooking show view. We're going to start putting this all together. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the brake shaft in. Brake shaft is right here. I did put a little engine oil on the bearings, on this stem of the axle tube, as well as the bronze bushing at the bottom of the axle tube. And it's pretty simple. Just take the brake shaft, you're going to drop that thing right in there like that, and just make sure it spins free, which it does. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your differential assembly. It goes in this position. This bull gear has to ride on the little gear. So we just kind of go in, we find the bushing a little bit, and then we just let it gently slide in. Line up the teeth, let it seat itself in there. And that's part of the reason why you want to kind of fit this all together. You want to make sure that this axle shaft goes through that bushing appropriately. That way when you go to put it all together, because we're going to have to put it down and kind of shift things around. These aren't like the 3-speed 2-piece transmissions or the 8-speeds. These things you gotta kind of dick around with them to get them to go back together. But in a nutshell, that's how we get that set up. Next, we'll start putting a few of the slide gears in and things to that nature. With the gasket in place, you can see I did put a little bit of the Durco sealer on it just to fill those pits in, just enough to fill the pits, nothing to actually build up. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to sit the case center section on the plate. Now, it's kind of hard to show you how to do this, but basically if we look right here, we can see that the brake shaft gear kind of over or covers the gasket itself. So as we're dropping, or as I'm dropping the center section of the transmission in place, I may have to take this brake shaft and lift it up a little bit just to move it out of the way in order to drop the case half over it. Also, it's a real tight fit on the bowl gear between either one of these, between these bolts right here. So again, gonna have to kind of shift it around, gonna have to kind of like, move things around a little bit and then set it down onto the side plate. It's a little cumbersome, but you can do it. You just gotta take your time. There we go. See what I mean? It's a pain in the back end, but it's seated now, or at least it's laying on top. Let me just go ahead and line it up a little bit better, and then I'll be right back. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to install the slide gears on the forks. Now we have the two slide gears. Whoops, there we are. Sorry. The big one's the first in reverse. The second one is second and third. Sorry. Second and third goes in first. It goes in this position in the case. So what we're going to do is we take the lower fork. We're going to push it in this position. Take our slide gear and go ahead and slide that. Whoopsie daisy. Slide it right on the fork, and then let it just naturally go back into position. First and reverse. We're just going to push the fork towards the brake shaft, so that way we can open up the area. Where is it? The slide fork part, or the slide section goes on the fork. In this, I'm kind of doing it. There we go. Now, so basically, when we're all done, see if we can, both the slide sections of the gears face each other, and both gears are outboard. So, and that's how that is. Next, we're going to put the cluster gear in place. Now, the cluster gear is a little bit interesting because we do have to shift the case this direction. Oh, sorry, that direction a little bit in order to get the big gear in place. Now, the case center section is not bolted yet to the side plate. So let me get that in place, the cluster gear in place, and then we'll go for the next step. This is a little bit tricky to show the installation of the cluster gear because it is so tight in this transmission, but I'm going to try to my best because you need about 4 hands in order to do this. Number one, the second and third gear, slide gear, you need to push it all the way forward till it touches the case. Now, that's not in the proper location, but for installation of the cluster gear, because the big casted gear on the cluster gear is at the bottom, not at the top, you just move the gear and the fork forward, just slide it forward. That gives you enough clearance to get the big gear past third gear, second gear, as well as the reverse gear ear. This ear that's down in the bottom of the case is actually in the way. You got to kind of slide the big gear underneath it. So right now I have it sitting on top of the brake shaft gear. I have the third gear pushed all the way forward. I got the teeth of the big portion of the cluster gear just under the ear. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of quickly jiggle it and rotate it into position. And then this shaft end on the other side, obviously, should slide into the bearing. With the cluster gear in place, you can see that the lower portion of the cluster gear is engaged to the input shaft. We have our third gear back in place. We have the first and reverse back in place. And to test it, basically what you want to do is make sure just take the shaft and spin it. Now the lowest gear on the cluster gear is pinned in with the Woodruff key. So you're just going to do that. And it should turn your brake shaft and this fairly smoothly, which it does. I got to fix this Woodruff key. Thing's falling out. But anyways, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install this Woodruff key on the top, and then we'll put the big gear on the cluster gear. So let's just go ahead and do that real quick. We'll do that. And then we're just going to take the big gear. We're going to line it up to the best of our ability so that way we don't lose that Woodruff key. And there you go. That, boom. And that's locked into place. Now we can take the slide shaft, slide it into the first gear, or first and reverse. You're probably going to have to kind of like manhandle it around a little bit to get it to slide through all the gears. And then it goes. And then we got to get it through this top gear here. Or we got to get it lined up so it'll settle into the input shaft. Let's go. It's a little difficult to do with one hand, but let me just go ahead and seat this. Basically, this thing's just going to drop down. So let me just get that lined up because I need both my hands, and I'll be right back. So after a little bit of wiggling and jiggling, I was able to get the slide shaft engaged in the input shaft. So that's all set. We take a look at our shaft heights. They're pretty much even, so we're good there. So we know those are seated in. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and start putting all the bolts in the right side of the case. I have all the bolts started except for one, and it's this one right here. And there's no particular reason I didn't put this bolt in because of the reassembly. The reason why I didn't put it back in is I can't get it in here with the curve of my vise. So I'm just going to leave that one to the very end. Now I got them all situated, but before I tighten them down, I'm going to pull each one out and put a little bit of sealer on the threads, especially the ones on the bottom, this side of the transmission, because the oil just sits there. I find that it's just going to migrate out if you don't put a little bit of sealer on those threads. So I'm going to go ahead and just seal each one up. I'm going to tighten it down. You know, it doesn't give a torque spec, but it's a 5/16 bolt. I usually do it to like, I don't even know. I'll have to think about that. I can't remember what I torque them to. Let me get them in place and sealed up in place, and I'll be back. I have the gasket on the opposing side glued into place with some gasket sealer. Before I go ahead and slide it on, I'm going to do a couple things. One is I'm going to grab each one of the shafts and make sure that they rock. So that way, because when we put this on, we're going to have to jiggle, just like everything else. We're going to have to jiggle this thing around and get it into place. So with that, we're just going to take a little bit of oil. Or again, we're going to take just a touch of oil. Glue it, or not glue it, but drizzle it on this axle tube end, just to make sure that this is a little bit pre-lubed. Give myself a little bit more. And we're going to go ahead and oil up the bushing, so that way that thing is all set to go. I'm going to wipe it off on my sweatshirt, I guess, and then situate it in the correct orientation. And then we're going to start putting it on. Find the bushing. Don't jam it on the bushing. There we go. Find the brake shaft. Catch the brake shaft. And this is where we're going to have to kind of wiggle and jiggle to get it. Okay, now we're just about to engage the cluster gear shaft and the slide gear shaft. Again, got to kind of manhandle it around in order to get it to line up, but it will go on. All right, I'm going to actually take this. There we go. It's installed. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and goo up all the bolts, get them all situated, and then I'll be right back. With the transmission out of the vise, I went ahead and torqued all the bolts to 15 foot-pounds. That should be sufficient to seal, as well as it doesn't put a whole lot of stress on the bolts, the threads, because if you remember correctly on the case, those webs for these bolts, except for the back ones, is really thin, and you really don't want to go crazy tightening these down because all you're going to do is crack one of those threads area. And ultimately, the transmission center section's junk after that. I did go ahead and install the oil seal here for the brake shaft. Very simple. Lube it up, slide it on, and actually I just used my little ball peen hammer, just tapped around it real gently, real lightly until it seated itself and it's perfectly smooth with the edge. So we're all set there. This particular transmission has the later model oil seals for the axles. Essentially, they're like an umbrella seal. I'm going to lube this all up with some oil, lube this area up here, lube up the rubber, slide it on. This is a brand new axle shaft, so I don't really have to worry too much about sharp edges. They should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and slide that on. And in this case, I think I'm going to try to find a deep socket to put this on. But let me get this started and we'll get it on. I went ahead and just cleaned up the end of the shifter that goes into the transmission. Shifted through the forks. The forks move nice and smooth. Went ahead and it's in gear. I can't remember which gear it's in, but whatever. And if you turn the input shaft in either direction, everything works good. So all the gears are in place, all the shafts must move nice and smooth because it feels really good. The one thing to keep in mind after you've put one of these transmissions together is they run a little tight. The clearances aren't the greatest in the world. So make sure that when you take this thing out for the first ride, keep it in first gear, run it around the yard, 2 or 3 little laps, not, full throttle third gear blasts. That way all of this can kind of settle back into where it wants to be. All right, guys, there is how I reassemble, or rebuild if you want to call it, a RJ, Wheelhorse RJ 5003 transmission and or a Wheelhorse Suburban 5010 transmission. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you like to watch these kinds of videos, please like, share, and subscribe. As always, I very much appreciate all your viewership, and I hope you have a nice day. Thanks, guys. Bye.